morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending where you are now. Welcome to the second webinar series of the Educations, Digitalizations, and Civic Space Working Group of the C20 Indonesia. I would like to say thank you very much for joining us today. We're really happy to welcome all of you. I'm Alia Yofira, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Policy Research and Advocacy, also known as ELSAM. We are a human rights-based organizations in Indonesia, and my work at ELSAM revolves around human rights and technology issues, which is closely linked with today's webinar topic, which is transformative digital technologies for equitable education. Today's topic is not only close to the 4 priority issues of the G20 Educations Working Group led by the Ministry of Education, Culture and Research, particularly the second priority issue, which is the digital technologies in education, but also highly relevant and closely connected with the 3 priority issues of the G20 Digital Economy Working Group issues led by the Ministry of Communications and Informatics, which comprises of connectivity and post-COVID-19 recovery, secondly, digital literacy and skills, and last but not least, cross-border data flow. Against this backdrop, today we will dig deeper and discuss more about the status quo, challenges, and recommendations moving forward concerning transformative digital technologies for equitable education, and also the important role that the G20 holds in ensuring this mission. Joining us today are our wonderful speakers and panelists, who I will introduce one by one. Firstly, we have Bapak Ahmad Tuhan, Sherpa of the C20 Indonesia, and also Prakarsa Executive Director. Halo Bapak Mahfud.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Bapak. Secondly, we are also joined by Bapak Dr. Anindito Aditomo. Pak Nino is the co-chair of the G20 Indonesian Education Working Group, who is also the head of Education Standards, Curriculum and Assessments from the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. Halo, Bapak. You're still on mute, but lovely to have you here, Bapak.
Apologies, yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Bapak. And thirdly, with us also Ibu Rachel Cooper, the education specialist from UNICEF East Asia Pacific Regional Office. Hello, Rachel Cooper.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Rachel. And fourthly, from Wikimedia Foundations, we have Ibu Rachel Judistari, who is lead public policy specialist. Lovely to have you here, Mbak Rachel.
Thank you so much, Malia. And also, it's my pleasure to be able to join this important forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, too. And next, the last Rachel of the 3, it's Ibu Rachel Fermin. She's the Regional Humanitarian Advisor Education from Save the Children. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And last but not least, we have Bapak Guru Murti Kasinatan as the founder and director of IT for Change. Hi, Guru.
Hi, I'm happy to be here with all of you and looking forward to the discussions today.
Really looking forward to discussions too. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. Thank you again for joining us today. Before we start with the next agenda, I would like to inform a couple of things, house rules for today's webinar. Firstly, for all the participants, we humbly request you to mute your microphone if you're not talking. Second, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write them down on the Zoom chat box. We also kindly request you to be mindful to others when giving comments or feedbacks. We do not tolerate any harassment in any form. Thirdly, this webinar is also live streamed in the Save the Children's YouTube channel. So if you are joining us from there, you're also very welcome to share your comments and questions there. And for all the speakers, we humbly request you to be mindful of the time. I will remind you to go over a speech and presentation. And lastly, we also provide sign language interpretations and English Bahasa interpretations, you can easily access it by clicking on the globe interpretations button on your Zoom application. Okay, that's it for house rules. Without further ado, for the next agenda, I would like to open up the floor to Bapak Maftu, the Sherpa of C20 Indonesia, to deliver his opening remarks. Bapak Maftu, the floor is yours. You're still on mute, Bapak.
Sorry. Thank you, Alia, for having me. Greeting from Mataram, West Nusa Tenggara. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Distinguished guests, CSO leaders across the world, colleagues and friends. Before I start, I would like to thanks to Working Group of Education, Digitalization and Civic Space of the Civil 20 for hosting these events. Congratulations to you all, and I hope the webinar will be fruitful and can create a concrete deliverables. I would like to thank also to keynote speakers, Dr. Anindito Aditomo, Excellency Nino from Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology of the Republic of Indonesia. He is also a co-chair of G20 Education Working Group. Thank you, Pak Nino. Thanks also to all speakers, Ms. Cooper from UNICEF, Ms. Judistari from Wikimedia Foundation, Ms. Fermin from Save the Children International. We have 3 Miss Russell today. And also thank to Mr. Guru Murti Kasinathan, founder and director of IT for Change from India. It is very strategic because the next year the presidency of G20 is India, so we should more closer to work together. Thank also moderator Alia from Elsam, as well as thank to all participants who joining this webinar. I do really appreciate it. Welcome you all to the webinar on transformative digital technologies for equitable education. As part of the process of Civil 20 Presidency of Indonesia 2022, it is very important, not only for CSO across the world, but also for a working group in Sherpa track as well as in finance track of G20. As one of official engagement group of G20, Civil 20 committed to work together with all development actors. We will provide a platform for civil society organization globally to bring discussion, ideas, political dialogues with the leader of G20, with the other engagement group, with other CSO leader as well. So Working Group of Education, Digitalization and Civic Space have an important role because bring 3 big issues: education, digitalization, and civic space. It's a very big issues and very important in each issues. So colleagues and friends, just for giving you an update, the educational digitalization and civic space already has 125 member organizations from 38 countries, both CSO from the G20 member countries and from non-G20 member countries. Why we include non-G20 member countries? Because C20 committed to bring the voices from the rest of the world, including from non-G20 countries. It is part of our principle that C20 should reflect of the voices across the world. So education, digitalization, and civic space working group of Civil 20 has aim to ensure the inclusion of civil society voices as part of civic space rights in the G20 agendas and processes, including in the assessing and getting quality education, quality vocational training, access to a technology and digital platform for all citizens in all countries. So the main objective of our webinar today is how we share understanding, how we share our challenges and our opportunities as a whole of our modality in education, digitalization, and civic space sector during COVID-19 pandemic and post COVID-19 pandemic. So your insights, your ideas, perspective is important and all are relevant. We should share our best practices as well from different contexts, from different countries, from different point of view, methods, and etc. as an option of a crafting of developing a solution that will be part of priority issues and policy recommendation in C20 Indonesia presidency processes. So the working group will hosting a series of a global webinar, and last week we already had our first global webinar with the topic on access to universal, inclusive, and safe quality education. And today is second webinar. As you know, the topic for today's webinar is transformative digital technology for equitable education. And then we will follow it by our third webinar, which is on June 10 with the topic on gender equality, diversity, and social inclusion in education, digitalization, and civic space. And then the last webinar is on June 29 with the topic on empowering youth with 21st century skills. And the last webinar of working group education will part of C20 policy dialogues in the end of July in Jakarta, and we quite confident that we will hosting in-person meeting. So overall, we will focus on the agendas of the education working group led by Ministry of Education, Culture, Research, and Technology. So we are very happy and honored to having Pak Nino today. So after today's webinar, we expect we can strengthen collaboration with education working group of G20. So once again, thank you, Pak Nino. And we also engage with a digital economy working group led by Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, and then a development working group led by Ministry of National Development Planning, and then employment working group led by the Ministry of Manpower. Lastly, with Empower initiative led by Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection. So with the other engagement group, with other official engagement group, we also try to align with Youth 20, Women 20, as well as Business 20, and UN bodies such as UNICEF, UN Women, and ILO. So we try to keep our principle to work collaboratively, strongly, reflect in all of our processes. So last but not the least, let's make this webinar an opportunity for us to make voices from civil society become heard, considered, and recognized for the stronger post-COVID recovery, especially in education and digitalization sector. We should deepen our work to push the G20 member countries to provide better education and a better vocational training for all citizens. And then digitalization must be beneficial to all and as a tool to realize the principle of leave no one behind. So let's make concrete deliverables and let's work beyond the principles. That is all from my side. And once again, I would like to congratulate to education, digitalization, and civic space, especially congratulate and thanks to Imelda for chairing this working group. So thank you very much everyone who participated, and I hope to see you soon in person for the next meeting of C20, which is C20 policy dialogue in the end of July. So let's work together stronger and let's recover stronger. Once again, thank you. Salam. Back to you, Miss Moderator, Alia.
Thank you so much for the warm remarks, Bapak. Borrowing Pak Martu's words, today's webinar objective is actually to learn from each other from different countries, to hear more perspective from different point of view as to how to make transformative digital technologies for equitable education. Now, on to the next agenda is a keynote speech from the G20 education working groups on the strategies for optimizing the use of digital and non-digital learning resources for equitable education. We have here Bapak Anindito Aditomo, PhD. It's also known as Pak Nino. Is the co-chair of the G20 Education's Working Group. He's also the head of the Agency for Standardization, Curriculum and Assessment at the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology of Indonesia. Pak Nino completed his undergraduate degree majoring in psychology at Gajah Mada University with scholarship from ExxonMobil, then continued his master and doctor of philosophy in education from the University of Sydney, Australia, with scholarships from Australian Development Scholarship and University of Sydney International, also his George Forster's postdoctoral fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundations. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. I'm opening up the floor to Pak Nino. Bapak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Miss Alia. Allow me to pull up my slides. hope it's showing up in your screen already.
Yes, Bapak, perfectly.
All right, Honorable C20 Sherpa, Pak Maftuhan, fellow speakers, and distinguished guests from around the world, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Assalamualaikum, Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu. And warm greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the C20 Engagement Group for inviting me to participate in this global webinar. This is a platform that is very important for us as well. It provides a meeting point among various working groups at which we can all ensure the inclusion of civil society voices in our agendas. Allow me to start by sharing how Indonesia is attempting to reshape our education system to contribute to a more sustainable, equitable, and inclusive society. In December 2019, so just before COVID brought about such massive disruption to our education system, the new administration in Indonesia launched a movement to comprehensively reform our education system. This is a movement that we call Merdeka Belajar, or emancipated learning. The goal of Merdeka Belajar is to ensure that all students, regardless of their social, economic, and cultural backgrounds, have the opportunity to develop competencies that will enable them to productively contribute to a knowledge-based economy, and also to actively and positively participate as citizens in a plural, democratic society. In other words, we want to ensure that our students not only attend school and are exposed to curricular content, but to actually learn and acquire the ability to use their knowledge in powerful ways. This emphasis on learning quality, on deep learning, as opposed to mere content or exposure to large amounts of information, is absolutely essential if we wish to help prepare the next generation for a future that is increasingly uncertain. A second dimension, in addition to quality, of our Merdeka Belajar initiative is equity. Similar to what you experience in many countries, the pandemic has forced us to confront the huge disparities within our education system, where opportunities to learn still very much depend on where a student lives, depend on the learning facilities they have or do not have at home, and the level of education support that their parents are able to provide them. So this realization has strengthened our commitment to not only recover from the pandemic, but to recover stronger in a more just way, to provide access to learning opportunities to all students. And for this, technology necessarily play a pivotal role. This is why in chairing the Education Working Group, we bring forward 4 priority issues. These issues tell a story. Recovery means working towards providing universal quality education. But we do not simply advocate going back to an education before the pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic has been a strong catalyst for change and the adoption of creative use of technology in many areas, including in teaching and learning. Thus, we also wish to encourage a reimagining of education through creative use of digital technologies, including and primarily by leveraging digital technologies to enhance partnerships in the spirit of solidarity, and also to prepare our students for a future of work post-COVID-19. This is another way to look at these 4 issues, 4 themes, where we place technology as part of the basic infrastructure to build partnerships and collaborations at the family and community level, at the regional and national levels, as well as globally, with the goal of providing universal quality education and to equip students with the competencies required for the future of work. Now, allow me to come back briefly to the Indonesian context. and to give you an example of how we are putting this vision into concrete action. In our Merdeka Belajar reform, we have developed many digital platforms, free-to-use online platforms to facilitate the work of educators. This is one of them. What we call the Merdeka Mengajar platform is specifically designed for teachers. This platform supports teachers to teach better. We are providing them with more than 2,000 teaching resources that they can use for free, as well, including tools to assess students' competency and understanding so that they can adjust their teaching accordingly, teaching at the right level. We also help teachers to learn, to grow professionally by giving them access to high-quality training materials through this platform. And we are also providing them a platform to create and share their creations and build portfolios to inspire and collaborate with other teachers across Indonesia. And in just 3 short months, this platform has been used by more than 300,000 teachers from more than 100,000 schools across Indonesia. Another example is Siplah, an online platform that enables school leaders to utilize operational assistance funds, BOS, the Bantuan Operasional Sekolah, in a secure way. In Siplah, they can procure necessary equipment for their school from trusted providers. So basically, this platform automates the use and reporting of school budget so that school leaders can focus on providing the best learning process and environment for students without worrying about procurement issues related to the use of school budget. As we are planning to cultivate as much benefit from the support of digital technology in education, it is of course important that we not turn a blind eye to the risks and challenges posed by these digital technologies. Among the mitigations that G20 member states have explored and implemented is ensuring data privacy and security in school systems by providing improving digital capability and cybersecurity, ensuring data empowerment and protection of individual privacy and confidentiality, developing secure platforms which respect privacy and ethical standards as part of learning facilities, setting clear standards on the processing of personal information, strengthening safeguards against cyberbullying and online abuse, as well as adding related modules in curriculum, including programming, digital safety, protection against cyberbullying, and personal data management. So, ladies and gentlemen, speaking here today and sharing practices from G20 members and our own Merdeka Belajar initiative serve as an important step in our journey to recover together and recover stronger. These agendas and strategies reaffirm our commitment to create and ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all children. In the spirit of Gotong Royong, let us put recover together, recover stronger into concrete, meaningful actions. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan.
Thank you so much, Pak Nino, for the keynote speech. Pak Nino highlighted the importance of ensuring the inclusions of civil society voice to the G20 process, and further on about leveraging digital technologies for equitable educations. And I'm really excited to learn more about how the Indonesian government is putting these visions into concrete actions. And of course, there is no one size fits all, obviously. I'm glad that we have moved away from that and opted for a symmetric and affirmative programs and interventions. But you also mentioned about data privacy and security problems, which we will elaborate more on the discussions later on. Thank you so much once again, Pak Nino. Really grateful and happy to have you here. And we are
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pak Nino. Now we are moving forward to our next agenda, which is the presentations for our wonderful panelists. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We have here Rachel Cooper, education specialist with UNICEF, currently posted in the East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, where she leads work on digital learning, adolescent skills and secondary education, gender and education. Rachel has worked at UNICEF headquarters in New York since 2019. And prior to joining UNICEF, Rachel worked at the World Bank's Education Global Practice, where she focused on girls' education, student assessments, and the role of the private sector in education globally. Rachel also previously managed a women's undergraduate scholarship program at the State University of New York. Rachel finished her master's degree in international educational development from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a bachelor's degree from the George Washington University. I'm opening up the floor to Rachel Cooper, who will be sharing about lessons learned from remote learning during COVID-19 in East Asia and the Pacific. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting UNICEF to participate in this panel and in this discussion. It's really an honor to be here with you all. And I just want to start by saying that I couldn't agree more with the speakers that preceded me in terms of the importance of really utilizing the promise of technology to focus on the most marginalized children and making sure that no children are left behind as the world moves to become more digitalized. So yeah, thank you to the speakers who preceded me as well. And if we could just scroll to the top of my slides in my presentation, that would be great. So I'm very happy to join you to talk about some of the findings and lessons learned on a study on remote learning during COVID-19 in the East Asia and Pacific region. And I will also be happy to share some insights in terms of the issues of digitalization of education. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think, it goes without saying, but I think it's also very important to put it in this context that, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were already facing a learning crisis globally and in the East Asia Pacific region. When we look at the rate of children in learning poverty, there's a wide range throughout the region. An average of 66% of children were able to read a simple text in the region before the pandemic. But if you look at the map that's shown on my slide here, you can see there's quite a range from only 2% in some countries to over 80% in others. So you really see a lot of variety in terms of what the education and learning situation was in countries throughout the region. With 1/3 of children who are experiencing learning poverty, because of that, hundreds of millions of children who were enrolled in school were performing below proficiency levels. As an example, in Southeast Asia, 2.2 million children in grade 5 had difficulty achieving foundational language skills in the early grades. And in some countries, up to 80% of children struggle to achieve foundational literacy and numeracy. When we look at the Pacific Islands countries, nearly 40% of students at the end of primary were failing to achieve minimum expected levels in literacy and 20% in numeracy. So the learning crisis was very real before the pandemic. And when we look at how different groups of children were performing and looking at issues of equity, the poorest children were most effective. On average, poor children from the poorest families were scoring about 25 scale points less than children from the wealthiest households. And with this underperformance at school and underperformance in terms of learning outcomes, it's also important to realize the very large numbers of children and young people who were already out of school, with about 33.3 million children and adolescents out of school in 2019. And when we look at the impact of COVID-19 on learning and on education delivery, it's undisputed just how vast the problem has been. There's been about 360 million children in this region who had their learning disrupted because of school closures. And nearly a third of countries in the region saw school closures, full school closures that went beyond the global average of 20 weeks from the beginning of the pandemic. In addition to the 33.3 million children who were already out of school before the pandemic, there's 2.7 million additional children who were in school before who are at risk of not re-enrolling due to school closures. And globally, when we look at the learning loss due to the pandemic, it's estimated that learning poverty could rise to up to 70%. And so this will certainly impact greatly children in the East Asia and Pacific region as well. And these learning losses really impact their trajectories in life as well. It's estimated that up to $5.9 trillion could be lost in earnings for children in low and middle income countries in this region because of school closures. So we can go to the next slide. So looking at this situation and some of the very concerning statistics that I've just mentioned, when schools closed, countries in the region really were innovative and implemented a variety of remote learning responses when schools closed. This included paper-based and take-home materials, broadcast media such as TV and radio, the use of mobile phones for learning, and digital platforms. And more than 70% of countries in East Asia and the Pacific established online platforms and provided take-home packages across all education levels during the pandemic. TV was also used quite widely, and to a lesser extent, mobile and then radio programs. Next slide, please. So I think it's quite positive that a number of countries were able to utilize digital platforms for learning. However, looking at this, we need to look at some of the enabling and constraining factors for remote learning broadly and specifically digital learning. So electricity access is a key factor for remote learning. Again, digital learning, looking at TV and other types of remote learning. But especially in rural areas, there are several countries where there's a large share of the population that does not have regular access to electricity. And these disparities are the greatest in Pacific Islands countries. So for example, in Papua New Guinea, 83.2% of the population in urban areas is able to access electricity versus just, excuse me, just 60% in rural areas. And so you can see, looking at this chart, some of the very wide disparities in terms of electricity access in different countries in East Asia and the Pacific region. Moving on to the next slide, looking at the issue of connectivity. So connectivity and devices are key enablers for digital learning. Yet, even where there's electricity, in many places, access to internet and access to devices for learning are quite limited. So as one example, Mongolia developed a digital platform for learning for students to be able to watch pre-recorded lessons and to interact with learning content online when schools closed for the pandemic. However, only about 1/3 of households in the country had access to connectivity before the pandemic, and just 2% from the poorest quintile of households had access to the internet. So even with having some of these platforms in place and having perhaps electricity, connectivity can be a big constraining factor. When we go to the next slide, looking at the issue of devices. So mobile phones are back one slide. Mobile phones are the most accessible technology for households across the East Asia Pacific region. However, they're not being widely utilized for digital learning. And this was one of the big findings from the study that we did. And so we know that access to a device does not necessarily equal learning. There's a study that was done in the Philippines that found that households with multiple children, one of the key constraints for learning is lack of mobile phones for learning. And especially when you look at potentially the size of households, really the number of devices matters. If a household just has one device, they may give preference to their oldest child to use for educational purposes, and then the other children won't be able to benefit from it as much. And looking at access to devices and access to the internet, it's really important to look at gender divides here as well. So globally, boys are 1.5 times more likely to own a phone and 1.8 times more likely to own a smartphone than girls. And when we look across countries throughout the world, only 27% of girls use their phone to access the internet versus 46% of boys. And even when children are online, there's gender differences in terms of how they use their mobile phones and the outcomes. And in the East Asia and Pacific region, in many cases, gender norms and stereotypes influence what content girls seek and are offered online. So it's very important to be aware of some of these barriers. And when we're looking at equity, of course, looking at children with disabilities and the unequal access that they have had to digital learning, looking at children impacted by conflict, children on the move, and other, I've already mentioned poor children, but ethno-linguistic minorities as well. So if we go to the next slide and take a look at the bigger picture, we know that that digital technology is critical for learning recovery and the transformation of education systems. Sorry, if you just go one slide further. And there's importance beyond COVID-19 as well. We know that digital learning will be critical in terms of resiliency for future school closures, either due to pandemics, due to climate emergencies, which are becoming more frequent and more severe, and due to conflict. So in terms of resiliency, but also transformation of education systems to look at the increasingly digitalized world that we're living in and really preparing children and young people for this digitalized world. So from our report, there's 6 recommendations that have emerged. And I'll go through these very quickly, and I welcome you all to take a look at the reports as well. I can pop the link in the chat after I'm done speaking. So the first recommendation is really to reopen schools as soon as possible. There's really no replacement for in-person learning. And so digital technology should be used to support teachers with in-person learning and to deliver blended learning. But we really, digital learning absolutely cannot replace in-person instruction, and it cannot replace teachers. The second recommendation is to ensure that all households have access to electricity, which is key to any remote learning strategy. Governments and partners must advocate for and invest in electricity infrastructure in the vast areas of many of the countries in East Asia and Pacific where there is no power, so particularly in rural areas. The third recommendation is to assess and understand fully the needs of education stakeholders, that's students, teachers, caregivers, school leadership, communities, parents. We know that physical health and nutrition, as well as mental health, really go hand in hand with the ability for lifelong learning. And so it's important to understand the infrastructure and device needs, as well as to develop specific strategies to reach marginalized students. Fourth recommendation is to combine different modalities to deliver engaging and equitable remote learning. So combining high-tech and low-tech or no-tech modalities. And we know that multiple modalities provide broader accessibility and flexibility for learning. And these modalities further should be integrated to allow for continuous learning across platforms. The fifth recommendation is to leverage partnerships to optimize the implementation of remote learning policies. And long-term partnerships can accelerate the process of learning recovery and transformation of the education system, but they can also help to serve as a safety net for potential future education crises. And there's really a role for all of us to play in working together on this. And finally, the last recommendation is to embed implementation research into remote learning practice. There's still a lot of gaps in our understanding of the impacts of remote learning, especially in low income and low resource settings. And so it's really important for us to build the evidence base as we're supporting children with digital learning. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I think, these recommendations and what I've just covered really do highlight UNICEF's approach to digital learning with a focus on learning recovery and transformation of education systems. And really highlighting that the COVID-19 pandemic really allowed for rapid innovation through technology and other new and creative solutions. And we really need to learn from those innovations and apply them to reach the children that are most at risk of falling behind. We know that digital learning solutions can help to close learning gaps for the most marginalized, to improve learning for all children, to provide flexible learning pathways and opportunities, to accelerate quality improvement reforms, and to close the digital divide. And so a priority action is for us to work together to harness the digital innovations brought about in remote learning and convert them into meaningful system transformation. UNICEF's Reimagine Education initiative focuses on reaching all children and young people with world-class digital learning. And it also includes some key enablers such as devices, connectivity, affordability of content and data, and engagement of young people on this important agenda. And while there's a lot of challenges that still persist in East Asia and the Pacific and globally, we're really focused on utilizing the technology that is already available to children and young people where they are and expanding access to learning opportunities this way. And so a key example of this is the availability of mobile and offline learning platforms that can allow children to access digital learning wherever they are. And I would highlight that our approach is also very much framed around the rapid approach, which is a joint initiative between UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Bank that really focuses on advancing learning recovery and advocating for countries to reach every child and retain them in school, to assess current learning levels, to prioritize fundamentals such as reading and math, to increase catch-up learning, and to develop psychosocial health and well-being to provide that holistic support that children and young people need. And I think that there's really a role that digital can play throughout that. And finally, to my last slide, I just want to highlight the principles of equity and scale to reach all children, no matter who they are or where they are, through multiple pathways to education delivery. And so very quickly, I just want to mention a few examples of where UNICEF is working in the region. So in Laos, UNICEF and the Ministry of Education, as part of a global partnership between countries, UNICEF and Microsoft deployed a digital platform called the Learning Passports. And it has its own instance, Kampanya Lao in Lao PDR. And it was rolled out nationwide to accelerate the rollout of the new national curriculum in Laos. It's an innovative approach that's made it possible to reach every teacher with teacher development programs and new quality teaching and learning materials. And it's been extended to children in some of the most remote parts of the country that typically have poor connectivity, because it's also able to provide content offline. And so far, it's reached about 90,000 users in Laos. The Learning Passport has also been used in Kiribati, and teachers have been trained on the platform, and they're now developing their own digital learning content on a weekly basis, which provides relevant, new, and timely learning content to the children living in even the most remote islands of Kiribati. In Vietnam, UNICEF is supporting the Ministry of Education and Training with the digital transformation of the education system through their National Digital Literacy and Transferable Skills Framework to ensure that all 21.9 million children are reached with affordable, gender-responsive, and inclusive opportunities for learning and development. These are just a few of the examples. There's many more. Many countries in the region are really doing really innovative work to reach children with digital learning, and they're showing a lot of promise. And so I would just say in closing, the pandemic highlighted the immense promise of technology. It's shown what's possible, but it's also shown the limits of this and the need to work together to realize technology's promise and to ensure that we're really not leaving any children behind in the digital transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your insightful presentations. We truly learn a lot about ways schools really try to innovate when the pandemic hits, but obviously it's not without its hurdles and challenges. Some of the constraining factors that Rachel mentioned earlier are the lack of access to electricity, inequality, in access to the internet and learning devices. Rachel also very wonderfully highlighted about the gender digital divide, in which boys are most likely to have more access to these modalities in comparison with girls around the world. There are various recommendations that Rachel has put forward to tackle these challenges and hurdles. And thank you so much, Rachel, once again. We are moving forward to the next speaker, but before that, I already see some questions. Please keep them coming, and I will pick them up later on the Q&A sessions after all the panelists have presented their presentations. Now, next, we will discuss more on the topic of policies recommendations on free knowledge agenda to expedite learning recovery and the rights to information for all learners. Here we have Rachel Judistari, the second Rachel. Rachel is the Asia lead for public policy in the Wikimedia Foundation. Previously, Rachel worked with the regional human rights organizations as East Asia and ASEAN Manager and ASEAN Parliament for Human Rights. For her dedications in the region, she's appointed as board member of the ASEAN Burma. But Rachel, I'm opening up the floor to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alia, for the opportunity. I would like to also convey my appreciation to the C20 working group on education, digitalization, and civic space for making this platform possible, and also for our Sherpa and representative of the G20 working group, Anandito. First of all, I'm sure that we've received very interesting and rich information from Rachel Cooper. So I will just add on informations on what the C20 sub-working group on digitalizations have created in the realm of privacy protections and also free knowledge. And for your informations, if you can go to the next slide, please, Mas Anggi. Thank you. So Wikimedia Foundation is the global nonprofit that makes knowledge free and accessible to everyone around the world. And we do this by hosting Wikipedia and Wikimedia projects, a collection of web projects that provide access to over 55 million articles across 300 languages, all for free and without ads. In May 2022 alone, 22 billion visitors visited Wiki project sites. And we are actually the only top website that is supported by a nonprofit. And our purpose is to ensure everyone can freely access trustworthy, reliable information, because we believe knowledge is a human right. When people have access to good information, they will be able to make informed decisions, build more just societies, and foster deeper connections. Next, please. As for the free knowledge agenda, as Rachel Cooper and also Pa Anindito mentioned earlier, the pandemic has pushed us to face the digital transformation, and there is no way of going back. However, the pandemic really showcased the best and also the worst in the technology. And because of that, if you can go to the next slide, please. When talking about platform for educations online, the C20 sub-working group on digitalizations highlighted that internet should represent the cultural and linguistic diversity of the world, because when we are talking about leaving no one behind, then the informations that should be available also need to reflect the diversities of constituencies that utilizing internet. And to reflect all of the world knowledge and achieve knowledge equity, we must have participation from all in the bottom-up creations of online knowledge that enable collaborations. These only can be achieved if internet platforms do not use any business models that may favor one kind over the other, or preventing informations from moving outside their ecosystem or compromise users' privacy, because privacy is inseparable from the ability to contribute to the free knowledge. When Rachel Cooper mentions about how children need to be able to utilize the internet platform, we also need to be mindful that policy architecture to ensuring privacy of internet users, especially children, need to be made available when we want to talk about inclusions. And to enjoy open and free knowledge on the internet, freedom of expressions need to be protected so that all users can express their opinion without fear of reprisals or censorships. In addition, copyright rules should encourage freedom of expressions online, not restrict it. And no one should fear for any reprisal for the content that they contribute online. After all, internet is not all scary. It also have unsurmountable potentials if free knowledge agenda flourishes. Next, please. So to be aligning with the topic of our conversations today, I also would like to share with you some of our initiatives on education that happening before and during pandemic time to instill the digitalizations phase that we all currently in. So the Wikimedia Foundations is working with community of volunteers in creating content. And these volunteers and independent affiliates also promote the use of Wikipedia in educations and for training in digital skills. Some examples include our collaborations with the local education offices in Yogyakarta, Bandung, and Padang to implement training for editing Wikipedia in high school and university. This is not only access to knowledge, but also capacity building on critical thinking of internet users, that is as part of the digital literacy that has been mentioned earlier. Second example is our collaborations the collaborations between Wikimedia contributors in Norway to conduct Wikipedia editing course with student of history of indigenous people in Arctic University of Tromsø. And in Germany, Wikimedia Deutschland and partner also launched an open education platform, free from any payment and free from any ad, in collaborations with the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. In addition, we also collaborate with government and intergovernmental bodies for fostering access to digital educations through collaborations with the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as flagship teachers training during the COVID pandemic. Because one of the critical aspects of COVID learning is also how to addressing the gap of teacher skill in delivering the educations online. And therefore, this flagship training has been implemented for teachers in Bolivia, Morocco, and Philippines. And throughout the process, the teachers provide very interesting feedback on how unique and stressful demand has been for them during the COVID-19 learning process. Next. I would like to specifically share with you our recommendation to G20 leaders on behalf of the C20 working group. So we have 5 main recommendations to uphold the free knowledge agenda as part of the digitalizations focus of G20. First, recommendation is to protect global internet freedom, because maintaining access to information and support free expressions online is important. We know that access to internet is human rights. So while we are working hand in hand in addressing digital divide and infrastructure gap, we also have to take in mind that intentional disruptions to internet access impact individuals' economic, social, political, and civil rights, and this includes in educations. So defending and expanding internet freedom is also a vital form of democracy, rights, and governance assistance. In lieu with this, safe harbor for intermediary is proven to be effective in promoting internet freedom. During the COVID-19, we also have witnessing some conflict happening around the world, and therefore in lieu with that, government should refrain from banning any online platforms, and banning those will lead to disproportionate responses that restrict users' cultural, social, and political speech. And it is also important to, again, providing access to digital literacy, as per shared by earlier speakers. Second recommendations on the protections of internet freedom is also how copyright should be used as a solutions, but and should not encourage restriction of online freedom of expressions, because we want making sure that all education's materials can be accessible by everyone freely and without any additional resources needed. Second recommendations is stronger privacy protections for users. While we are talking about education's access, often we are only thinking about young children's that accessing internet, but we need to be mindful that education's is a long term, or even like throughout the phase of our life process, meaning that everyone, not only children, but also adult, is the recipients of education's content. And because of that, we urgently need privacy laws that curbs platforms' powers to track and profile users and prohibit data uses that discriminates against or harm people. lawmakers and regulators in G20 countries should definitely take steps to give people more choices and control over what data online services can collect from them and how those data can be used. We also need strong enforcement mechanism to ensure that paying fines for privacy violations do not simply become a cost of doing business. While we want to making sure that COVID education's gap would be improved with the use of technology, we need to make sure that the online architecture also have a strong privacy protections for users. The third recommendations is to have a progressive regulations to promote decentralized collaborative content moderations. This is in lieu with how greater transparency of platform decisions and system need to be available, because although some platforms voluntarily report certain numbers about quantity and categories of content removed, but it provides only a narrow snapshot into actual moderation practices. Therefore, transparency should definitely encourage among and within platforms, and community content moderations models like what we've doing in Wikipedia with the emphasis on human-centric critical judgment can be utilized. And then next recommendations is how we all need to support the principle of net neutrality and oppose practices that allow for-profit service providers to abuse their market powers in ways that prevent people from accessing knowledge. We all know that like some of the platforms have harmful business model which generate advertising revenue based on user engagement. And these platforms have natural conflict between combating harmful disinformation and maximizing their profit. Often content which is polarizing or even sensational receives more engagement from the users. So profit maximizing algorithms amplify this content and spread even further. This accounts for much of the proliferations of disinformation on online communications platforms. So when considering regulations, G20 government should first looking at regulations on business models that insensitive in business model of the platforms and how some of it often lead to the promotions of misleading or controversial content based on profit metrics. And lastly, I think the C20 working group on digitalizations, also wanting to recommend the G20 leaders that free open source need to be available for public goods, including educational content. And it needs to be free from business interests, because if we want to expedite the learning loss that happened during the COVID-19, then we need to work hand in hand together to making sure that diverse content and then protections of users' privacy online is embedded within the free and open source knowledge content. So with that, I would like to say thank you for all of the participants that has been joining us today, and back to you again, Alia.
Thank you so much for the very amazing presentations, Mbak Rachel. Couldn't agree more with Mbak Rachel's statement earlier about how knowledge is actually a human rights, which is widely protected not only as the right to education, but also part of our freedom expressions that is protected under international human rights law instruments. In Indonesia, I think particularly we are seeing a growing and concerning trend where information which has educational purposes is being more and more restricted under the pretext of censorship. So this is actually links back to the Mbak Rachel's recommendations earlier about why protecting the global internet freedom is highly crucial and relevant for education as well. Some other important things that Rachel mentions are about how the internet represents the cultural and linguistic diversity of the world, and privacy and data protection should go hand in hand with the utilizations of digital platforms for online learning purposes. Thank you so much once again, Rachel, for your amazing presentations. Now I'm opening up the floor to our next speaker, who will be sharing about policies and mitigation strategies for meaningful pedagogies in school educations, who will be represented by Guru Murti Kasinathan. Guru Murti is the founder and director of the IT for Change. He has 30 years of experience in the development and corporate sectors. Guru leads projects in the area of education, including in research, demonstrations project, systemic teacher education reform, and policy advocacy. His areas of expertise include integrations of digital technologies in school educations, teacher educations, and pre-service teacher educations. His interests include school leaderships and free and open digital technologies. Guru, one fun fact actually, guru in Bahasa Indonesia actually translates to teacher. So we're really happy to have you here to share about this topic. The time is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Alia, guru means teacher in many languages. As far as I know, even in languages in Africa, many of them, when I say my name is Guru and I'm a teacher, I think we have to credit my parents for having named me appropriately. They knew that I would be a teacher before I was, at the time I was born. So that's just a remark in the lighter vein. I'm going to give a perspective from that of a teacher. What we find very often, and this is inevitable, is that in discussions in global spaces, very often the discussion gets monopolized by certain groups of people. And particularly when it comes to technology, we find that many times that discussion is very informed by technology platforms, technology products and services, vendors, business models, and sometimes the primary purpose of that particular technology, which is in our case, we are talking of education, that sort of gets lost sight of. So I'm going to focus more on that, and I'm going to make certain statements which might look very unusual, against the grain, and it's my hope that we may spend some time thinking about them and whether they're valid and therefore what we can do about them. So the first thing I want to say is that UNICEF, and I'm happy the speaker on the panel also reiterated that there is no alternative to schools. And I think this is important to reiterate because many people are increasingly saying that the brick and mortar school model of the school is history, and we don't really need a physical space called the school because digital technologies can reach knowledge, content, information anytime, anywhere, and therefore the traditional model of enclosing children in a particular space is no longer required. And this is a completely false view, and not surprisingly, this view is propounded and promoted by technology companies. And the technology companies would like the world to believe that digital technologies can replace schools. And I think many people have highlighted that learning is not simply sharing information, which is what digital technologies can very easily do, but learning and education is much bigger program. It's not only a program of the child acquiring understanding of the world around her, but it is also the space for building abilities to interact with one another, acquiring values of tolerance, ability to live together in a peaceful manner. And these abilities are only fostered, or I would say primarily fostered, in collective spaces. So the popular imagination that a digital technology connection to a child who is sitting in her home and connected to a teacher and other learners who are all sitting in their own spaces can somehow replace a school, this thought should completely go away from our mind. And this is important because we must remember this, because the costs of COVID have been very high for education. And I think the UNICEF speaker also shared a slide which talked about school closures. Now, the data of the pandemic clearly said that younger people were not vulnerable to the virus. It also said that the younger the child is, the less vulnerable the child is because of various biological factors. Hence, school should have been the last institution to close. Unfortunately, in India and in many other parts of the world, schools were the first to be closed because there was a fear that if the schools are open, children will suffer, children will catch the virus and they will die. But we know that cases of COVID amongst children are very, very few, and fatalities are simply not there. They're hardly negligible. They may be in, decimal points. But the costs of keeping schools closed, which again was pointed out in the slides in the by the UNICEF speaker, they are very, very heavy. In India, for example, schools were closed for most of 2 years, and educators say that children have lagged behind not by 2 years, but by more than 2 years. So a child which was in class 3 2 years back has now come to class 5, but the child has forgotten what it learned in class 2 and class 3. So the child which is now in class 5 is actually at class 1 level. So there's a regression in learning, and this regression will be very, very difficult, if at all possible, to make up. So the first point I want to make is we should clearly look at keeping schools open. Schools should be closed only if we see a risk and threat to children, that they are dying or falling seriously ill in large numbers. Otherwise, we must keep schools open, pretty much like how we keep factories open, how we keep offices open, even though there are cases, because we recognize that the economy cannot be locked up for a long time. It will be fatal to the world economy. In the same way, if we keep schools closed, it will be fatal to society, not even the economy. It will be fatal to society. So right now we must think that if it's absolutely necessary to close schools, that is when we should talk and think of digital education. Other than that, we should think that digital education should not be an option that should be considered and should be kept on the table. Governments can keep preparing to equip people with digital technologies so that the inequity in digital technologies is reduced. That's a different program, but that need not be confused with introducing children to digital education. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is, now that schools have opened all over the world, I don't think schools are closed anywhere in the world at this point in time. Maybe there may be few exceptions, but for example, in India, schools are open all over the country. And when schools are open at this time, it's most important that face-to-face time between the children and the teacher and among the children is maximized. And therefore, if you are focusing on digital education at all, it must be primarily to support the teacher. The classical imagination of digital technology is directly working with the children. As an educator, I want to seriously caution this thinking. As an educator, as a teacher educator, I want to caution that we should equip digital technologies for the teacher first. And the teacher should be so equipped that the teachers will decide in what form they want to reach digital technology to the children. It should not be a situation where companies are bypassing the teacher and directly reaching digital technologies to children. This is again a classical image that is promoted, that teachers are not required anymore, or teachers' role is much lesser. The children can directly access X repository or Y repository or X app or Y app and learn. And this is something that is going to be very harmful to the cause of children's learning. I'm talking not only from a conceptual point of view. I'm a part of the National Coalition on the Education Emergency, which we have set up in India. And the National Coalition on the Education Emergency has conducted research studies. It has collated research studies done by other people across the world. And the conclusion is extremely clear that school closure is extremely harmful to children. And not only it's harmful to children, this harm itself is very inequitable, meaning the communities that are more backward, the communities that are remotely located, the communities that are traditionally socially marginalized, economically marginalized, poorer communities, they are the ones who are affected most by school closure because they have no ability to access digital technologies. In India, for example, less than 10% of the households are able to meaningfully access digital technologies. And this number is so less that digital technology should not be considered as a systemic option at all. It should be provided to everybody. I'm not against digital technology per se. I'm not imagining or advocating that the poor should be kept out of digital technology. Not at all. The poor, everybody should get digital technology. In today's world, we should see it as a right, the right to internet. But we should not confuse that with the right to education, which is best provided in a face-to-face form. There are two reasons for it. One, as I said, is In India, less than 10%, as I said, was able to access digital technologies. The gap is too vast. And I'm sure this gap is true not only for India, but even for Indonesia, which is a group of so many islands. You'll have a lot of challenges to make sure that connectivity goes everywhere. There will be forests, there will be mountains, there will be remote habitations, and everywhere there will be the same problem. So in the near future, in the middle term, do not think digital education is a solution. In the long run, everybody should get technology, and then we can look at what it can do for education, but not in the immediate time period. By immediate time period, I would say even in the next 3 to 5 years. And secondly, research is completely concluded that face-to-face education is vastly superior than digital education. This is even more so for school education. Maybe for higher education, it is possible that the learners are also adequately equipped to learn by themselves, and therefore some processes, some programs of blended learning may be useful for them. But young children, particularly in the developing world context, and that Indonesia, India, many of the countries may not be G20, C20, but across the world, we can certainly say that children are not yet ready for accessing and being able to participate in digital education and learning from that. Connectivity issues are very severe. That being the case, digital education should not be confused with real education. There are two harms from technology. So whenever you talk about digital technologies, I find that people talk about the benefits, but people do not talk about the harms. And there is a person called Neil Postman, and I would request everybody on this webinar to read Neil Postman's Basic Principles of Technology. And he was talking about technology, not only digital technology, but his principles apply to digital technology as well. The name is Postman, Postman, and he argues that technology benefits some people and harms some people. We should not think that every technology benefits everybody. There is a harm and a benefit, both are there. And what he says, the people who benefit from it want to convince the people who are harmed that the people who are harmed are actually benefiting from it. So it's a very complicated thing. He says the winners want to convince the losers that the losers are the winners, so that they will support the paradigm of digital technologies. The first problem that we see is that of digital addiction. We are all addicted to our devices. I know that everybody on this panel cannot stay away from WhatsApp for even half a day. And if our mobile phone is taken away from us, we will die of withdrawal, in a very short period of time. And people know about addiction. It's said, scientific research says that addiction caught at a younger age is more dangerous. So if you start smoking at the age of 40, you may give it up. But if you start smoking at the age of 13, you will not be able to give it up. So addictions caught at a younger age are more dangerous. All along, we have been thinking children should be kept away from digital devices and internet. And now we are encouraging teachers and parents to give it to them. So in India, for example, people have been calling for national de-addiction programs because teachers are saying when the children are coming to schools, they are not able to pay attention to the teacher. They are not able to interact with other students. They are not remembering anything that they've been taught. They are not doing their homework. And all these are connected to the fact that they have become addicted to the devices that they have been given at home. And parents are repeatedly asking, saying, can you run a de-addiction program? And that is something I think C20 should strongly recommend to the governments, that a program of digital device de-addiction may be very much required for school children. And that de-addiction also means that there must be significant management of the access to digital technologies being made available to children. That's the first point. And also, I think there are enough research to say that children have become vulnerable to sexual abuse and violence thanks to digital technologies. So we should not only think technology is connecting us to the world, and that is a good thing. That connection can be a problem for children because we protect children. We do not allow our children to go to dangerous places on their own. We will tell them, no, you have to stay at home. There is a bomb outside. There is a terrorist outside. We don't tell the children, why don't you go outside and play when the terrorist is there? So the technology not only connects us to good things, it also connects us to bad things. And that should be kept in mind. The other important point, and my colleague, my panel member from Wikimedia Foundation mentioned it repeatedly, and I'll strongly support her. The nature of technology ownership is extremely important. Now, all of us have been saying privacy of data, privacy of data. Now, I want to ask a very simple question to everybody who talks about privacy of data. Is privacy of data possible when the software is proprietary? It is not possible, because when the software is proprietary, it means we do not know what is in the code. Therefore, we do not know whether the vendor is collecting data from students, from parents, from teachers, whether it's commercially harvesting it, selling it to others, renting it to others. We know that those practices are very common. So let us stop using the term data privacy, because in my opinion, it is a meaningless term. It means nothing, because it is like saying I want privacy, but I don't know, I have to beg the proprietary vendor to give me privacy. The vendor is not going to give you privacy because you have no clue what the vendor's code is doing. So I would take one point forward and say that in education, we should only use software that is free and open, which means the software is accessible, open, available for study, and we can make sure that there is no collection of data. And we must remember, in education, we are talking about children who are more vulnerable than adults, and therefore data privacy word should be dropped. And we should say that all technologies, all platforms, all apps, and I would really request UNICEF and all the other multilateral bodies also to stop using data privacy alone, because data privacy cannot be ensured by proprietary software, and say that free and open technologies has to be mandated in education. What I'm saying is not only theoretical. In India, for example, the edtech companies started collecting data of the children and started using it to bombard them with false programs, which were deceiving the families and making them logged into debt. And the government of India issued an advisory saying that the parents need to be very careful of the claims made by the edtech companies, and they should not give out their data to the companies. But the advisory is not a mandatory thing. We need regulation. We need a policy across the world, and G20 should take a lead in this to make sure that proprietary technologies are kept out of education. And again, what I'm talking about is not only theory, because China has actually implemented that kind of a policy last year. They have said that in education, we should only have free and open technologies. I'll end my presentation with this last slide. I think we should change the popular imagination of digital technology in education from providing content and resources to children directly and bypassing the teacher and using proprietary software. So instead of that imagery, let us replace the imagery with using technology to support teacher capacity building. Let teachers use free and open source software. Let teachers create open resources like Wikipedia, and teachers should take the technology and the technology resources to the children. That way we can make sure that children are protected from abuse and they are not rendered vulnerable by the edtech companies. So therefore, not for children directly, not proprietary technologies. Support teacher development, support free and open technologies. I would say if you're able to use these two principles, then we can make sure that pedagogy will indeed be transformed by technology. Otherwise, what we are going to see is that public education is going to be hollowed out by technology in the next few years or so. So I will stop my presentation. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Guru, for your powerful presentations. I couldn't agree more. I really second your statement about how being biggest archipelagic nations, Indonesia, that is, connectivity is a very costly problem. There is a gap in internet penetration, let's say from Java Island to Papua Island, and this has affected online learning in Indonesia. Guru also echoed a lot of Rachel's concerns earlier about privacy concerns and online learning, and also about free and open technologies, how crucial they are in order to make sure that privacy is embedded into how we use technology for education purposes. Also, lastly, Guru also highlighted about the problem around online sexual abuse, online gender-based violence are also some of the things that really need to be taken into account by the G20 leaders and all of us. Thank you so much once again, Guru, for your presentations. Really learning a lot from the conversations. And now on to the next panelist. Last but not least, we will hear from Rachel Vermeer. Rachel is the Regional Advisor for Education in Emergencies at Save the Children's Asia and a part of the humanitarian technical team. Part of her functions as Regional Advisor is to support ongoing humanitarian responses and the preparedness of country offices on EIA. Rachel has been involved in various humanitarian responses since 2014 in the Asia region and outside. Rachel is a special needs teacher by professions and training. She is based in Metro Manila, Philippines. Rachel will be sharing about overcoming digital divide for equitable education. I'm opening up the floor to Rachel. The time is yours, Rachel.
Thank you. good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be in this your part of the world. I'm very honored to be part of this webinar and share with you all some of the work that we are doing in Save the Children. So again, I'm Rochelle Fermin. I'm the Regional Humanitarian Advisor for Education from the Asia Regional Office of Save the Children. And I'm joining you all from Metro Manila, Philippines. Today, I'll share with you some examples of strategies and the best practices that we have learned in the implementation of technology or digital solutions to reach the most marginalized learners in our education programs. So majority of these examples and experiences will be coming from the Asia region, since I am the regional advisor, but I will also share with you some of the work that we're doing outside Asia Pacific. You will probably hear me repeat many of the insights that the earlier speakers have already shared, and I will just enhance these with some very practical examples based on our experiences in the organization. But before that, let me just give you a quick overview of Save the Children's ambition until 2030. As you can see on this slide, our ambition is for all children learn from quality basic education. And to do this, we need to continue to be the voice for children, advocating for equitable right to education for all children at all times, and using our common approaches or our proven and tested education programs to address barriers to quality learning. Building relationship with key stakeholders who will be able to make our ambition a reality. And finally, coming up with innovative solutions to address age-old problems in education. And one of these innovations is the use of education technology. Unfortunately, because of many reasons, we know that not all children are able to learn from quality basic education. And especially in our region, there are many children, such as those who have disabilities, those who are migrants, refugees, or those who are affected by humanitarian crisis, who have their education frequently disrupted. And in 2020, COVID-19 pandemic closed schools for extended period of time. In the beginning of the pandemic, Save the Children did a research to understand the hidden impact of COVID-19 on children's education. And this is what you can see on my slide here. And some of the key findings were 8 in 10 children felt that they were not learning at all or learning very little when they were during school closure. And 80% of children reported having obstacles to learning. More than 35% said that they didn't get any help that they needed to do their schoolwork. More than 10% of the children reported they didn't have any form or didn't have any access to any form of learning materials at home to help them during school closure. Children who were not going to school reported an increase in negative feelings. There was also a strong association between children who reported learning little or nothing at all and the likelihood for them to drop out when schools reopen. Now, armed with this knowledge and our experience to responding to crisis, Save the Children geared up our education response for COVID. So it is from humanitarian crises such as the recent and ongoing pandemic and other disasters that I draw these examples from. Here, I will share with you some of our learnings in the implementation of technology or digital solutions to reach the most marginalized learners in our education programs. So what are these learnings? First, we have to understand the learners that we want to reach, what resources they may have, what access to devices they may have, what their needs are. Before finalizing the strategies for the program pivot we were going to implement, Save the Children in Nepal office conducted a media access survey to understand the target audience inclination towards the media during COVID-19 and also identify the most effective media tools to communicate and disseminate education-focused messages and lessons. The results show that majority had access to mobile phones and radios. Thus, the use of mobile phones and radios were prioritized. In Afghanistan, our team conducted a rapid assessment to determine the applicability of alternative pathways that the Ministry of Education has put forward to ensure continuity of learning. The assessment allowed Save the Children and its partners to understand accessibility of television, radio, and internet as remote learning modalities. Well, based on the assessment results, it showed that the communities had very limited access to television, to radio, and especially internet. So the results indicated that small or reduced class sizes are the most preferred option for most families that were surveyed. There was also issues on lack of electricity, radio or TV coverage, and of course the literacy level of the parents. And these all affect children's ability to access the learning pathways of the Ministry of Education. Another learning that we have from our girls' education project in Bangladesh is to conduct regular assessment of learning to ensure that the strategies that we use, including the technology applied, are effective and appropriate to the learners' needs. Our next learning is to combine solutions that work, and I think you have heard this from the earlier speakers as well. So with a clear understanding of who our learners are, we also understand which strategies work best for them. And what we have seen that worked well was to combine different strategies to maximize the impact. And this can be a combination of high-tech, low-tech, or no-tech solutions. For example, using self-paced learning modules and combining this with teacher follow-up via WhatsApp, or worksheets for children to do at home, and then having small group face-to-face tutorials several times during the week. And it's also important to include digital literacy as content if there will be tech-based distance learning. And I would also like to reiterate what our earlier speakers have mentioned. And this is providing safe learning environments for children. So this means maintaining safe digital or physical spaces wherever children may be accessing their learning opportunities. This is an example from our Ukraine response. Save the Children is implementing digital learning centers. So while children have access to online learning materials, they also have activities with teachers as well as access to reading materials. Children have access to cloud-based learning content and training that can be accessed anytime from anywhere on any device via free mobile applications. So this is the layout of the digital learning center. Another important strategy is to mobilize home and community to be able to continue to support children's learning at home. This is obviously very important when there is no crisis and children are able to remain in school, but it's even more important during those times when schools are closed and schools pivot to digital or even hybrid learning. Some examples I have here is Project Aral, or access to resources for alternative learning. Children are provided access to quality learning and holistic development experiences with their families at home. This also includes COVID prevention messages. And parents and caregivers are given information to support their children's development and the use of positive discipline at home. Save the Children Nepal developed a radio series called Ramundai Sikdai, which means enjoy and learn. This targets parents and caregivers. It is an edutainment-based educational radio program aimed to build the capacity of parents and caregivers in conducting various family learning activities that support their children's learning and well-being at home. So the next learning is to continue to support teachers. Education technology must support teachers and must not seek to replace them. This was also mentioned by our earlier speakers. So it's very important that teachers are able to continue building their capacity so that they can better support the most marginalized learners, especially during digital learning. So during COVID-19 school closures, our team in Afghanistan was able to continue the critical pre-service training of teachers using a combination of IVR calls or interactive video recorded calls, SMS, and the use of WhatsApp. There were a total of 12 modules that was designed as part of the curriculum for teachers, and each week one module was taught using the IVR calls, and they also sent reminders through SMS. In Nepal, we established digital hangouts with teachers or virtual conferences with teachers to discuss the challenges posed by COVID-19 and identify opportunities and innovative breakthroughs to ensure a enabling learning environment for children during crisis. I'd also like to mention that the teachers in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh used the Learning Passport, which our colleague from UNICEF also mentioned earlier. In Ukraine, there is an online professional development program for teachers so that they are able to adapt teaching practices for crisis settings, build their digital skills, and heighten their awareness on child safeguarding, among other things. And I think this is my last point, supporting learners and teachers' mental health and psychosocial needs. We have to remember that in crisis, teachers are also experiencing distress, but may have limited access to mental health support. For teachers to be able to continue delivering quality education and support learners' mental health needs, their own needs should also be addressed. As for learners, we have seen in the hidden impact for COVID-19 research how school closures have deprived children of opportunities to be with their peers, thus resulting to an increase in negative feelings. Face-to-face classes should complement the digital tools and resources to provide that much needed MHPSS for children, either through psychological first aid sessions, psychosocial support with teachers, and of course, those natural interactions with their peers. These are all I have for now. There's many more, but thank you for your attention. I hope you picked something new up from this presentation and maybe some inspiration from the work that we have done. Just keep in mind that technology is not an end in itself. It is a tool or a collection of tools and approaches to help address problems and increase our reach of education services if needed. And ultimately, we aim for better learning and well-being outcomes for our children. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're learning a lot from your presentations. And of course, the pandemic hits everyone differently, and it hits the hardest for the most marginalized learners, particularly children affected by armed conflict, like in Ukraine. Understanding what's really needed, combining solutions that work, mobilizing home and communities to support children's learning, supporting teachers, and also taking into account the mental health and psychosocial needs of children is also highly important, and that was beautifully highlighted by Rachel earlier. Okay, now we are going into the questions and answers sessions. We're going to discuss all of the questions. Thank you so much for putting them down on the chat box. I already summarized several questions that were directed to all of our speakers. So the first question is for Rachel Cooper. The question is, indeed, that technology has potential to improve learning outcomes, but around the world, access to it is highly unequal, particularly for students who live in out-of-reach places. This inequity hurts their social mobility and chance to grow. So what do you think the NGOs and private sectors can do to ensure G20 leaders fulfill their promises to provide everyone inclusive, quality education for all by 2030? Rachel, unfortunately, we have a very limited time left, so maybe you can just answer that very briefly in 1 minute.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to answer very briefly. And I think, some of the speakers that followed me, I think touched on some of these issues as well that I think provide some good insights. I think one thing that's important mentioning is the importance of having solid ICT master plans in place that are budgeted, that have clear accountabilities to really set some of those system level standards and to set the stage for proper implementation. region to really reach the most marginalized children and young people. So really, I think having that at its core in a system, especially moving beyond emergency response to COVID, is really important in the long term. I think also recognizing, of course, that governments can't do it alone. And so I think that NGOs have a really key role to play, first of all, in advocating for reaching for some of the most marginalized and hard to reach communities, but also utilizing their on-the-ground presence as well to help to reach those communities. And I think with the private sector, what's really important, I think that there's a lot of potential in terms of partnering with the private sector and utilizing technologies and ed tech tools. The government has a really crucial role to play in terms of ensuring that content is of high quality, ensuring that it's aligned to the curriculum, ensuring safe access. There's been a lot of points raised in the chat and also in these discussions in terms of data and privacy issues. And so I think the government really needs to serve that that role in terms of holding companies to account and protecting children and young people in their use of technology. Over.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your answer. Now on to the next questions. The questions are for Guru and Rachel Arini. We all know that the massive online learning during COVID-19 pandemic has fostered children data collections largely by ed tech companies, so education technology companies. I found in the Privacy International findings that one of the largest ed tech company in Indonesia collect too many data. They offer access to their e-learning platform for free, but the app in Google Play includes 8 separate trackers and 34 permissions, including 9 marked as dangerous or special level according to Google's protection levels. I believe that we should protect children from any violations, including their rights to privacy. How the G20, C20, and us all protect children's personal data and deal with those kinds of violations done by ed tech companies? How's the experience from various countries? I will give the first stage for Guru. Very briefly, Guru, 1 minute. Over to you.
Very, very quickly, as I said in my speech, there is no way by which, if the software is proprietary, we can be sure that the company is not collecting data. And you heard the phrase data is a new oil. I mean, you may not fully agree with it, but what we're really saying is data is the mechanism by which digital companies are going to make money. And therefore, they're going to be ruthless about accessing data, collecting data. They will sell it, they will let it out, they will lease it, rent it, and do whatever they want to do. And while this has larger implications, politically it has implications. We know that what happened when Facebook gave away user data to Cambridge Analytica, we got Donald Trump as our president. So that kind of a scam is happening from country to country. Elections are being manipulated. That's a threat to democracy. The threat to education is worse because children are going to be manipulated ruthlessly by companies. Their families are going to be targeted by predatory loans, and it's happening already in India. There are many stories how edtech companies are forcing parents into products and services that they cannot afford. The solution is very simple. As I said, we should not allow any proprietary technology in education because education is about young children and we cannot make them alarming. Point 1. And we should not think this is a theoretical or some wishy-washy idea because, as I said, China's already made many of these regulations that I'm talking about. They're already applicable in China from last year onwards. So edtech cannot be commercial, edtech cannot be proprietary. These are important points that we must keep in mind. And free and open technologies are quite popular. For example, the slides that I presented was using LibreOffice software. I don't use Google search, I use DuckDuckGo search. I don't use a Windows system or a Mac system, I use a Linux system. So in school education in India, free and open source technologies are quite promoted in various states. And I think this is a message for the world. That's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guru. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you for the questions, Alia. I think as the questions specify Indonesia context, definitely one thing that we need to demand together for the Indonesia government is to pass the data protections and privacy law that has been on pending for the past few years. This is very critical because not only children that are have these proportionate risk on exposing their data in these educational platforms, but also like all of us who has been utilizing applications to tracking our movement in lieu of the COVID responses, also exposed to the similar degree of risk. So that's one step. Second step is definitely to build on digital literacies among students, so that they are prepared on how to protect their personal data and also informations online. And thirdly, I think what needs to be done in G20 process is to making sure that data protection is highlighted in the outcome documents that the leaders will created, and because that broader themes of G20 this series on digitalizations, we cannot solely looking at financial gain and commercial intentions as part of the leader's statement, but we need to also making sure that human rights and data protections are embedded throughout the leader's commitment. So I'll stop there, and giving back the floor to you, Alia, if there is any additional questions or closing of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So the last question is for Rachel Berman. During the COVID-19 pandemic, how are the people with disability reached by the education method? What kind of approach that used by countries to keep the learning system inclusive? I see that Rachel Berman has put down the answer on the chat box, but do you want to take that questions and elaborate very briefly, Rachel?
Yeah, sure. Just maybe just just to add on what I've already written. So these are just some of the examples, and I'm sure there are others that I am not able to recall right away right now. But I think it's important to also highlight here the role of parents, especially during school closure, and how we really tried to leverage their making sure that the parents are able to continue to support children, and especially children with disabilities who have very limited access to the different the modalities that are offered by the ministries of education. So that's what I would like to highlight, and also just to maybe go back to some of the points that I've mentioned earlier in my presentation, to understand the learners that we are trying to reach before we try to develop any of the strategies that we would like to use.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your answer. Everyone, sadly, we're now arriving at the end of today's webinar. On behalf of the Educations, Digitalizations, and Civic Space Working Group of the C20 Indonesia, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude and appreciations for all the panelists, Rachel Arini, Rachel Furman, Guru Murthy, Rachel Cooper, and all the participants, our interpreters, Mada, Firman, Devi, and Weni, who are with us today discussing a lot of important topics around transformative digital technologies for equitable education. I personally learned a lot from the conversations, and I hope the same thing goes to all of you. I would like to also inform that as part of the webinar series, the EDCSWG, we will have 2 more upcoming webinars. The next webinar is on Friday, 10th June 2022. The topic is about gender, disability, and social inclusions in education, digitalizations, and civic space. And the last part of the webinar series is scheduled for Wednesday, 29 June 2022. And the topic is youth empowerment for stronger post-COVID recovery. Once again, thank you very much for today's very insightful discussions. Thank you also to the Education, Digitalizations, and Civic Space Working Group team, especially the Save the Children Indonesia team, whose hard work is highly appreciated for making today's webinar and many more to go possible. Thank you so much, everyone. Please stay safe and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye, everybody.
Alia. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Rachel Cooper, Rachel Fermin, Rachel Arini, Mbak Alia, and also Guru Murti. Everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mbak Melda and Save the Children team.
Sama-sama, makasih. Akhirnya selesai ya, sudah. Okay. Oh, it's still live?
I think it's still live.
Mbak Alia, could you turn it on, please? Mbak